Welcome to those who are signing in right now. We will get started in just a few moments. We'll just let people get settled. So again, thank you to everyone who's signing in right now. We're going to get started in just a moment. We'll just let people get settled. Okay, welcome to everyone who is joining us, and thank you for joining us today for our special two-part summer webinar. Before we get started to the main content, I just want to take care of a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so if you missed part of it, you've already signed up for it, so you'll get the recording in an email in the coming days, so you can go back and review the information that we covered today. Additionally, if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them. You'll find a Q&A tool in the tool ribbon down at the bottom. In the Q&A box, like I said, go ahead and ask any question on our topics today as you think of it. We will get to the questions kind of at the end of each of the presentations. As I mentioned, it's a two-part webinar today. So like I said, feel free to ask those questions at any point during, and we'll get to them during the Q&A periods. So our first presentation is on electric vehicle charging and how the rental housing industry has a role to play in that. And in British Columbia itself, we have the highest rates of electric vehicle adoption, which of course means we need more infrastructure to support that adoption of this technology. Today, we have Laura Bryson from Switch Energy and partnering with Sparkle Solutions through their Sparkle Charge Solutions to present on this very timely and important topic. So also like to thank both Switch and Sparkle Solutions for sponsoring today's webinar. So Laura, I'll hand it off to you. You can go ahead and share your screen and take it from here.
Great, thanks so much, Hunter. And let me just pull up my slides here. Everyone can see them okay?
That's great.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is electric vehicle charging in multifamily buildings. And in particular, we'll talk about rental apartments, which looks a bit different than, for example, stratas or condominiums. And I'm pleased to present this in collaboration with Sparkle Charge Solutions. Sparkle is a service provider for multifamily buildings that provides a range of services, including a turnkey program for electric vehicle charging in collaboration with Switch, where essentially there's no upfront hardware cost for the charging stations, and we provide a fully managed service. So knowing that everyone in the audience probably has a different understanding of the EV industry, I like to just talk a little bit about where things are going and what's happening in the EV industry from an EV sales perspective. Some of you may know that British Columbia is actually leading North America in EV sales. It has highest rates of EV adoption in North America currently. And that's really driven by different factors, including, for example, policies. So British Columbia does offer an incentive for the vehicles themselves and for the charging infrastructure. But then on the technology side, the battery range is improving and EVs are becoming more affordable, and there's also just more models that are coming out. So we're really seeing this shift happening. And this graph here that I'm showing, you'll see here in 2020, for example, we got up in Canada, electric vehicles represented 3.5% of new vehicle sales. And if you compare that with British Columbia was at 10%. So BC is really leading the way along with Ontario and Quebec. And an important target to be aware of is the Canadian federal government announced a target for zero emission vehicles. They're targeting 10% of light duty vehicle sales per year by 2025 and 100% by 2035. It was originally 100% by 2040, and just a couple weeks ago they pushed that up to 2035. So there's a lot of different factors that are really propelling this movement in Canada and worldwide. The policies here that I've shown on the map, these relate primarily to new construction buildings. So there's been a lot of changes in policies that are requiring new construction buildings, both multifamily buildings and commercial buildings, to have a certain percentage of parking spots to be EV ready. So Vancouver, for example, in multifamily buildings, 100% of parking stalls need to be EV ready, compared to in commercial settings, right now the percentage is 45%. And there's different definitions about what EV ready means, but for the most part, it's accepted as having or being capable of powering a level 2 charging station, either at each parking stall or in adjacent parking stalls. And again, BC is really leading the way in terms of these policies. There are some jurisdictions that have similar policies, but by far, BC has the most extensive for these new construction buildings. And being in the multifamily rental and management space, it's important to be aware of how these policies are impacting new builds, and ultimately how that's going to trickle down and impact demand for charging from residents at your existing buildings. This slide here is really just trying to emphasize where electric vehicle charging takes place. The data shows that the majority of it, as much as 85%, takes place at home. And the reason for that is because it's a very different model than fueling a gas vehicle. So for gas vehicles, you go to a gas station, that's that. EV charging is different because at home, you primarily have access to either a level 1, like a 110 volt outlet, or a 208 volt outlet, like you would use for a washer and dryer. And so charging takes a bit longer, and it's kind of like charging a cell phone. You plug it in when you get home and it's ready to go the next day, or it's ready in a few hours depending on your battery size. So what we're seeing with all of this charging taking place at home, in home settings, or in workplaces, those are really the most convenient places to charge, and hence why we're seeing so many requests coming in. This slide here, I like to show the different components of the EV charging station. This last picture here, this is the actual level 2 charging station installed. But leading up to that, you have, all the way at your transformer level, which is essentially converts the power to a voltage that's suitable for home appliances like a dishwasher or a washing machine or a charging station. And that's providing power to your main service and your panels, which are ultimately bringing power through the conduit and wiring to your level 2 charging station. You may have heard level 1, level 2, and DC fast, and the distinctions between them. So level 1 is really, you can charge an electric vehicle with a level 1 outlet, but it'll take a really long time. So the sweet spot for multifamily settings is level 2. And that, like I mentioned earlier, it runs on a 208 or 240 volt circuit. And it's very suitable and convenient for charging an electric vehicle. It'll charge a plug-in hybrid that has a smaller battery in say a half an hour, and it might charge the longer range vehicles in a longer time period, like 6 to 10 hours from completely empty to full. And if you compare that to a DC fast charging station, that's what you would see along the highway or in retail settings, where people spend a shorter period of time parked and say they need a long fast charge to complete their journey from point A to point B. That's where the DC fast charging comes in, and it's not very relevant to multifamily buildings, because as you can see here, the cost, you're getting up to $50K just for the unit itself and another $50K for the installation and for the electrical infrastructure. So the level 2 is really most suitable for multifamily buildings, both in terms of price and in terms of the service that it's providing to EV owners. In multifamily buildings, there's really two models, one being private, where residents can access their own personal EV charger in their own parking spot. And then on the other hand, shared charging, where multiple residents can access the same set of charging stations in a visitor or communal parking area. And there's pros and cons to be aware of, but I think there's no silver bullet approach. It really depends on your building and what the demand is like. If residents are willing to help support the cost to put in their own private charging infrastructure because it's more convenient, they want that. And then in other cases, when you have limited parking available, or you have floating parking where residents aren't necessarily going to the same parking spot every night, shared charging makes a lot of sense. And with the right tools, it becomes a common amenity, like your washer and dryer or your gym or your pool. And it can really support a growing number of residents with electric vehicles. So don't get too overwhelmed with this slide. There's a lot going on here, but I did want to touch on the three main approaches to electric vehicle charging, because you're probably, if you're looking into EV charging, there are service providers that are probably promoting different approaches, and I think it's important to be aware of the different options and how they differ and some of the pros and cons for each. So on the far left here, we have the approach of having a non-networked charging station, meaning the charging station, it's not connected to the internet. It's simply when you plug it in, it starts charging. And that would be tied to a sub-metering system. And in that approach, as you can see here, each charging station is connected to its own meter. And you can get automatic payments through a sub-metering company to have the billing associated with the charging stations taken care of. But the limitation is that there's no load management, meaning that, let's say you've got a limited capacity in your building, then once you've maxed that out, that's that, and you'll have to upgrade the infrastructure. And then you also wouldn't have access control. So it would be challenging for, say, a shared community charger where you can't tie that usage back to an individual user. And then on the right side here, we've got another approach where, again, tying the non-networked or the non-internet connected charging stations to a smart panel. And if you compare that to the middle approach where the charging stations are networked, you can sort of think of it as in the middle with the networked charging stations. The smarts is in the charging station itself. The charging station is connected to the internet. It's tied to a central system and providing data and remote control. Whereas with on the right here, the smart panel approach, the data is all in the panel and the control is at the panel level. So again, different approaches and pros and cons to each. For the smart panel approach, there is a level of load management provided, but it's limited to essentially the capacity of the panel. And so let's say you've got capacity for 10 charging stations. Once the 11th charging station comes along, or once the 11th driver comes along, they can't start charging until one of the other drivers stops. Whereas with a networked smart charging approach, you can dynamically adjust the output based on however many drivers are charging at once, and even take that a step further with priority load management, where drivers can say, I need my car charged by 8 a.m. in the morning, and the system will dynamically adjust the output to make sure that everyone gets charging at the same time. And in BC, we're really seeing that the recommended ratio of charging stations to a circuit is 1 to 4. So if one charging station is on one 40 amp circuit, it wouldn't be recommended to have more than 4 charging stations per circuit in order to achieve this load management. And I'll get into a bit more in a later slide about load management and how that all works. So the takeaway here is really the middle option here with networked charging stations that are internet connected. They can be remotely controlled. This provides automatic payments, dynamic load management, and access control. So this was the slide I was mentioning, which illustrates here how the load management works. So without load management, you essentially have one charging station that can be in use. If you have, assuming you've got a 40 amp circuit, you can have one charging station at full output, and these 3 charging stations can't be used. With load management, on the other hand, you can see it's basically sharing the capacity. So it'll split it in 4 or in another proportion based on driver input priorities. So load management is really the most powerful tool that we have to manage demand in a building, and not just from a capacity perspective, but also in terms of demand charges, depending on certain times of day when vehicles are charging. Load management is a really powerful tool to help keeping those demand charges in check. Another important element to be aware of with the charging stations is open standards, and the global open communication protocol for EV charging. It's called OCPP, Open Charge Point Protocol. It's administered by Open Charge Alliance. You can look it up online, and they list all of the companies around the world that are open standards compliant. But you can kind of think of it like a cell phone. If you buy a cell phone that is from Rogers or Bell, you're locked into their service. Whereas if you buy an open standards charging station, then it can be managed by any group of service providers. So it's just important to be aware of when you are investing in the charging station hardware. A question that you could ask your service providers, if the price increases, or if I'm not happy with the service, do I have the flexibility to switch down the road? Here I've outlined just at a high level the steps that you would go through to implement EV charging in your building. And we usually recommend by starting with understanding the demand for charging. We have survey templates that we can provide if you're interested in gauging demand from the residents. But some of you may already have requests coming in, and you know that it's something there's already demand for. The survey could help you get a sense for residents that are even considering down the road at buying an EV, what their time frame is when they're considering buying an EV, whether they'd be more interested in private or shared charging. The second and third point here, I think they go hand in hand. I think you could interchange them, but you'll want to do a site visit, and ultimately you'll select a service provider that will help you think through the best plan. And in a later slide, I'll talk through the financing mechanisms that are currently available. But BC Hydro, the province of BC has some great rebates, and one of them actually is starting with an EV ready plan. So a service provider will come in and take a look at the building, take a look at the parking layout and the capacity, and make recommendations for how to move forward. So for example, with your current capacity, you'll be able to support X number of charging stations in a load managed configuration. And they'll also help you think through how, as demand grows, how to scale the charging infrastructure cost effectively. As an example, there's a lot of different factors that can affect the cost of the installation. where they are in the parking lot. You'll want to locate them as close to the electrical room as possible. If you have to bring power up or down a level, that can affect the cost. So even just thinking about where you're locating them in the property, your service provider will help you think through that. And steps 4 through 6 here, you'd review your proposal and have the budget approved, and then work with the service provider to oversee the installation. So your service provider would bring in a certified electrical contractor to complete the installation and provide the charging station hardware, and your service provider would then provide that ongoing service. So for example, providing that access control, the automated billing, and any reporting that might be required if you're interested in seeing the usage data. So the next few slides, I want to just focus a bit on Sparkle's offering that is in collaboration with SWTCH. As I mentioned, it's a turnkey program where Sparkle will essentially come in and work with you from the beginning, from the site assessment through the installation. And one of the main benefits of this program is that it's offered at no upfront cost for the charging station hardware. So Sparkle essentially owns and operates the charging station hardware, and SWTCH is providing some of the back end support, like the access control, the network management, the load management, and helping with the billing component. Because from what we've seen, properties, they don't really want to get involved in the billing component of it. SWTCH takes care of all of that by tracking at the transaction level, at a charging station level, how much energy is being consumed. We bill the end users, and then all of the funds go to the property on a quarterly basis. This is a quick look at the admin dashboard. So you'll get access to all sorts of usage data from number of transactions, revenue, and energy consumption over different time periods. And it's meant to be very hands-off for the property, but if you are interested in taking a look and understanding the data and understanding the usage to better inform your decisions down the road, the data is really all there. And as part of the service, we're providing 24/7 customer support as well. This is a quick summary here of essentially what we're providing through the Sparkle multifamily program, which I mentioned there's no upfront hardware cost. So you're essentially covering the cost of electrical infrastructure to the point of installation. And as part of this program, the resident pays a monthly fee to access the charging station, and SWTCH and Sparkle collaborate to provide a fully managed service, owning, maintaining, and monitoring the charging stations. And last but not least, I will provide a bit of information on the funding opportunities that are currently available. There is both provincial and federal funding that's available. So at the provincial level in BC, it's called the Clean BC Go Electric EV Charger Rebate Program, which they recently updated to have 2 streams. So option 1 is called the EV Ready Rebate. And so that provides funding for the EV Ready plan, funding for the infrastructure itself, so the electrical infrastructure, the wiring, conduit, and then also funding for the charging stations themselves, up to $97,000 per apartment or condo complex. And then on the other hand, there's the Standalone EV Charger Rebate, which is essentially funding just for the charging stations. This program's been around for quite a number of years, and they've recently reopened the program and have started accepting applications, and the funding is on a rolling basis. So essentially until it runs out at the end of the government fiscal year, and then we'll see what happens for next year. I think everyone's optimistic that the program will be around. And then the second option is the federal funding, which it's offered by Natural Resources Canada. It's called the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And that provides up to $5,000 per charging station, up to $5 million per organization. And this one provides 50% of all costs. So everything's included from the charger hardware to the install. And this can also be for new new and existing buildings. And this one is an annual program. So the program just closed mid-June and is scheduled to reopen in May 2020. So if it's something that you're thinking about, it makes a lot of sense. And the federal program, it is a bit more time intensive, but there are groups like Switch and Sparkle that can help navigate those programs and work with you to help understand what the reporting requirements are. So with that, I would like to open it up for Q&A, and thanks so much. I'm looking forward to hearing what questions you might have.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for that presentation and great information. So yeah, going right into some questions.
Did you want me to stop sharing my screen, Hunter, or?
Why don't you keep your contact information up there just a little bit longer?
Okay.
So when it comes to having, say, four charging stations per, I think it's 140 amp circuit, is that correct?
Yeah, so I think I'd mentioned the 40 amp circuit, like a 1-to-4 circuit share ratio.
Yeah, so would that be enough to generally kind of future-proof buildings? And if all 4 stations were being used at the same time, would that significantly reduce how quick these vehicles can charge?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's been quite a bit of analysis that the province has done, and organization like EV charging organizations and nonprofits that are focused on EV adoption that have done to really understand what that impact is. And the consensus is that that 1-to-4 circuit share ratio is more than sufficient to meet the daily driving needs of Canadians, because Canadians aren't, I mean, it varies from person to person, but for the most part, people aren't charging every single night, because, let's take a standard EV that has a range of anywhere from 300 to 500 kilometers. You're not necessarily needing to charge every night. And again, that's where the priority load management really comes in, is if there are certain days that every driver needs to use it, then having the priority load management to essentially define when you need to be fully charged by that would help with that as well. But from what we're seeing in the data, it's really only about 5% of the time that Canadians are going a really long distance that they need, for example, the fast charging stations to complete their journey from point A to point B.
Right. Yeah, you can go ahead and take that slide down now if you want.
Okay.
So great. So yeah, it obviously might potentially cause a problem if everyone was using it at the exact same time all the time. But as you say, that's not really the reality for this type of technology.
Exactly.
And that makes sense. I mean, people don't go to the gas station every single day. Most people don't live that far from work, at least hopefully. When it comes to these rebates, you mentioned the Clean BC rebate. Is that something, do you know if that's something that's available for new builds?
So the Clean BC rebate targets retrofits, and I believe that's because so many jurisdictions now have the requirements for new construction builds to have a certain percentage, EV ready. So the Clean BC rebate is really intended to target and to support new builds, though the federal program, the Natural Resources Canada one, that one is both for new and retrofits.
Yeah. So going to the program itself that's offered by Switch, is this a program that is based on a revenue sharing model?
So Currently, the main program it's offered in collaboration between Switch and Sparkle. It's not based on a revenue share, but there's no the main focus is the hardware cost. So the cost for the physical charging station that's eliminated through the program. So there's no upfront hardware cost. Actually, I guess I should say there is revenue sharing, but more from the transactional. Each of these charging stations, they'll be used, energy will be consumed, and all that's being tracked. So we'll set an hourly usage rate, let's say anywhere from 80 cents to $2, depending on what the property prefers. But let's just say $1.50 on average. Then Switch is keeping track of all of that and then sending funds to the property on a quarterly basis to make up their energy consumption costs.
Right. Okay. So to the cost of getting this installed, how much would you say an owner can expect to pay per station after some of these incentives?
This is a really tough one just because it can vary so much from building to building, and depending on where the parking stall is. I mean, it can, without the incentives, it could range anywhere from 2K up to 6 or 7K. So, have that for when there's a rebate involved.
Right. So I mean, and yeah, as you say in our discussions that we had prior to this and leading up, a large part of this really comes down to what the building is set up for already. So what capacity loads it has in place already, and what type of parking facilities exist, which of course are different from building to building. Kind of a good question here on enforcement, and I think this is going to be our last question before we get onto the next section. So again, before we get to that question, I just want to thank you again, Laura, for joining us and providing this great information, and thank you again to Sparkle Solutions for making this connection through their partnership. So the last question that we have here is, how does a landlord, how does one enforce someone who is parked in one of these stations to move once they've been fully charged, to make it available for someone else?
That's another great question, and definitely one that comes up a lot, especially when you're talking about shared community charging infrastructure that can be accessed by multiple people. I know a lot of property managers are concerned that people will loiter and just keep their vehicle parked there. So one mechanism, we have a few different mechanisms. Our most popular one is a loitering penalty, where essentially it could be time-based or it could be based on the vehicle's state of charge. So the user would get a notification when their vehicle's fully charged, and then they'll have a grace period, say half an hour or an hour, to move their vehicle. Otherwise, a higher rate will kick in. The other option would, instead of it being based on the status of the vehicle and when it's charged, but just based on a time limit. So you could limit to say 4 to 6 hours. And again, a loitering penalty can kick in once that time limit is up. The other option is a reservation system where users can see in real time if the charging station is available, and people can actually book it for certain periods of time. But we see definitely the loitering penalty being the most popular, just because it's very effective at getting people to move.
I can see how that would be very effective. And I mean, it is a very real issue. I think that anyone who's ever used something that's in some ways very similar and tied to Sparkle, which is, laundry, shared laundry facilities, that's one of the biggest issues, is people just not turning over quick enough. And there's not much difference, I think, in this. So yeah, I think that makes sense that there's some type of a solution there. That's great. Again, thank you so much. Thank you to all the people who sent in questions. If you do have more questions, Laura has provided her contact information. We will share that again with all of the people who have registered for today's webinar in our thank you follow-up email that'll come out in the next couple of days. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much to LandlordBC and Hunter for having us, and we're happy to serve as a resource as different groups are thinking through how to move forward with EV charging.
Great.
Take care, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Just let me switch this over very quickly. Just be one more moment here while I just bring up slides. So our next part of the presentation here is going to be on two recent changes to the residential tenancy branch and the processes provided by the residential tenancy branch. Both of these changes come about from the Rental Housing Task Force, which was an initiative started by the provincial government to investigate the rental housing industry, gathering information from renters, from tenants, from advocacy groups such as LandlordBC, and from there generate recommendations to help improve services from the residential tenancy branch, and in general help improve the industry as a whole. These recommendations were released in 2018, and over the years we've seen changes come from that list of recommendations. The two changes that we're talking about today were likely supposed to be in place, or were supposed to be in place last year, but of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, things have been pushed forward. In both of these processes, LandlordBC has been intimately involved in developing what this process looks like, from ensuring the policy meets the needs of landlords and rent housing providers, as well as being transparent to tenants, just continuing to make sure that our voice and the voice of this industry is heard when making these types of policy decisions. We're going to start with the updated process for ending tenancies for repairs or renovations. This updated process really updates the 4-month notice to end tenancy process as it relates to ending tenancies, repairs, or renovations. The notice itself still exists for the other reasons, such as demolition. But again, we're going to talk just about ending tenancies for repairs, renovations, and then we'll move into the additional rent increases for capital expenditures. As mentioned before, if you have questions throughout this presentation, go ahead and ask those questions, and I will do my best to get to them at the end of the presentation. So what has changed? Well, the primary difference is that instead of serving a 4-month notice to end tenancy, which tenants can and often do dispute, landlords will now have to apply in advance for an order of possession. And this is done through the residential tenancy branch's dispute resolution service. As mentioned, it's done in advance. And the order of possession will be effective for 4 months after it is served. So in the past, you would have served a 4-month notice to end tenancy. The tenant would have had a period of time to dispute that notice. You would have had a hearing several months later. And from there, an arbitrator would decide whether or not they're going to give you an order of possession. The change is now that the application for an order of possession is essentially front-loaded. It's something that happens at the beginning of the process. You will gather your information, make your application. An arbitrator will review the information and to determine whether or not the tenancy needs to come to an end. If they agree that the tenancy needs to come to an end, they will issue that notice to end tenancy, a order of possession. And again, that is effective for 4 months after it is served. So So this is what the new section is. When looking in the Residence Attendancy Act itself, you find this under section 49.2 of the Residential Tenancy Act itself. So when we look at, and actually we're just going to go back to this because this, when we look at what this section says, it's not significantly different than what was in the Residential Tenancy Act before. It goes into detail that these renovations require the rental unit to be vacant, and that they are necessary to prolong and sustain the use of the rental unit or the building in which the rental unit is located, and that the only reasonable way to achieve this, to be able to conduct these repairs, is to end the tenancy. So we're going to go into each one of those items in a bit more detail. So if we start with prolong and sustain. So to be able to qualify for this type of end of tenancy, you need to be able to show that the work that is being done is necessary to prolong and sustain the rental unit. So the work that is being done is something like seismic upgrades or updating the electrical wiring to bring it up to code, replacing sprinkler systems to, again, meet code. This is the type of work that is often quite significant, which might require the unit to be vacant. We'll get to that in a moment, but certainly does obviously work to prolong and sustain the life of the rental unit and the building itself. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the type of projects that could be contemplated for this type of work, but certainly is a starting point. So the next criteria for this is that the work that needs to be done requires the unit to clearly be vacant. There's no way that a tenancy could possibly continue while this work is happening. And there's really two ways in which we can look at this. One is that the work will make the unit or the building unsafe for residents, or that the work will result in a prolonged loss of service or facility. So an example of something that's unsafe would be that there is a significant amount of asbestos in the building, there's a long remediation process that's needed for that, and clearly the tenants cannot live in the building while asbestos remediation is occurring. And when it comes to a lot of these types of projects, whether or not the intention is to remediate the asbestos, you often end up having to remediate asbestos as part of the process itself, simply because asbestos is unsafe to work with. In terms of loss of service or facilities, again, these have to be significant services or facilities, such as no water, no electricity, services and facilities that are fundamental to the tenancy. So we look at reasonable accommodation. So the other part to this is saying that there is no other way to have this work done. So you do have to try to work with your tenants to find alternatives to end the tenancy. If the work is, for example, going to take a shorter period of time, might be very significant. It might mean that the tenancy, the tenant can't be in there while this work is being done, but it's not for a long extended period of time. You may be able to work with the tenant to have them find alternative accommodations for a shorter period of time to then return to the unit. Again, this is going to be very situation dependent and not always something that you're going to be able to accommodate or be able to accomplish. So when it comes to making this type of application, before applying, you must have all permits and approvals in place. If permits themselves are not necessary for the type of work that you're being done, which, to be honest, is quite unlikely with the degree of work that needs to be done to qualify for this type of end of tenancy, But if there for some reason is no need for a permit for this type of work, then you should be prepared to provide some type of documentation from the municipal or provincial authority or a qualified engineer or tradesperson that shows that permits are not required. So it's not enough to simply say permits are not required. You have to show that permits are not required because of the type of work. Now, one potential problem with obtaining permits is that occasionally, depending on the scope of work, some permits cannot be obtained up front. There are some permits that can only happen after, for example, the unit has been vacated. So if that is a situation where part of the project does have permits that you'll need to get, but you cannot get them in advance, there's no way to get them in advance, then you need to provide documentation that you are not able to provide that permit at that time. And this is why. It's something that I can apply for, that I should have no problem obtaining, but I cannot obtain at this point because the process provided by the municipality or provincial authority does not allow for me to obtain it at this time. That might mean getting a letter from the city along with the general contractor, engineer, architect, whoever it is that is doing the work in that regard. Cosmetic repairs are generally not something that is considered significant enough to warrant an end of tenancy. So the work that, again, we go back to, the work needs to be so significant that there's no way the tenant could possibly live in the rental unit for an extended period of time. And while many projects that you may undertake will have an impact on the tenant, perhaps be a nuisance to the tenant while they're living through these repairs or renovations, they can in fact still live in the unit. And some of those examples are painting walls, replacing light fixtures or electrical sockets, not the full electrical system per se, but just electrical sockets and outlets themselves, replacing cabinets or countertops, sinks, toilets, showers, bathtubs, those types of updates that are generally meant to update the decor are not again generally found to be extensive enough to warrant that end of tenancy. So when we go into the process itself and how do we start this process, we look at these initial steps. Well, it really starts with a landlord coming up with a plan, documenting the full scope of work and why the work is required. So we go back to the Prolong and Sustain part of the Residence or Tenant section in the Residence Attendancy Act, where it says this work, you need to be able to demonstrate that this work is required to prolong and sustain. So when you're developing the plan for this project, that should be an integral part of that plan, is showing why it is required. And why it is required may be simply that you've had an assessment of the building completed, and there is seismic upgrades must be made to meet current seismic code, the building code regarding that. So again, it can be as simple as that, but it does need that documentation, which should be as robust as is possible. Those will need to work with their tenants to say, okay, if does this work really need to happen? Is there alternatives that we can come up with when it comes to perhaps temporary vacancies from rental units? And that, again, that's where reasonable and possible. You should also be aware of any municipal requirements for tenant relocations or compensation, which may be above and beyond what is required by the Residence Attendancy branch. So some municipalities and some across the province have additional plans, tenant compensation, tenant relocation, tenant protection plans in place that landlords who are going through a redevelopment or this type of work will need to consider as part of their project planning. Once you've gone through those initial steps and you've determined that, yes, this process is right for me, you need to make an application. The application is for an order of possession through the Residential Tenancy Branch's dispute resolution process. It can be found on the online portal. The fee to apply is only $100, and that can apply to every affected unit. So when you apply for a building that has, say, 10 units in it, you are applying for all 10 units at the same time, if all 10 units are being affected by this work. It means that you only have to do the work when it comes to getting the evidence ready and such once. As part of the application, so that there's the initial application, and it's going to ask you for your evidence. You need to serve both the Residence or Tenancy Branch and all of the named tenants with evidence prior to the hearing. This evidence should show why the work is necessary and why the unit needs to be vacant. The tenant may also supply evidence as well. So this is a standard hearing process. And because of that, like I said, both parties have an opportunity to supply evidence. So the tenant has evidence that the work is not that significant and they could clearly live in the unit while this work is being completed, for example. Well, that's a valid argument to make. And if they have that evidence, they can supply it. At the hearing itself, which will be a teleconference, you as a landlord need to be prepared to review the evidence that you've submitted, rebut any claims or evidence posed by the tenant, and of course, answer any questions that the arbitrator may have. Both landlords and tenants will have an opportunity to speak at this. The process generally is set for an hour. It may be a bit longer for this, but again, both landlords and tenants will have an opportunity to speak. So after the hearing, an arbitrator will review the evidence, consider any testimony that was presented at the hearing, and render a decision. A successful application will be granted an order of possession, which, as I mentioned before, is going to be effective for 4 months after the date it is received by the tenant. Much like the 4-month notice, there is compensation that is owed to the tenant for ending the tenancy for this purpose. It is 1 month's rent. Additionally, tenants are able to leave earlier by giving 10 days notice. And again, this is exactly the same as the process that was in place prior, which is the 4-month notice to end tenancy. Again, much like exactly like the 4-month notice to end tenancy, tenants have a right of first refusal. This is in place only for buildings that have 5 or more rental units. And the way it works is that before leaving the rental unit, before actually vacating at the end of their tenancy, they must alert their landlord that they would like the opportunity to exercise their right of first refusal to return to the rental unit. If you've received this notice, you'll need to inform your tenant 45 days before the unit is available. Returning tenants will be subject to signing a new tenancy agreement, and the rent will be set at market rent. So they're not returning to the rental unit at the same rent that they had previously. Again, much like the 4-month notice, exactly like the 4-month notice and the 2-month notice, if a landlord were to end the tenancy using this process and then not actually go through the work, the tenant would be able to apply for additional compensation up to 12 months rent, which is quite significant, clearly. And we don't foresee that as being a significant issue for most landlords, because if you're going through the work to demonstrate that you are going to, in fact, actually do this work and you're applying for this process, it's a lot of work to go through to develop a plan, get the permits in place and such, to not actually follow through with it. So again, that's something that's very important. Where an issue may arise is if you did not properly go through the process for the tenant's right of first refusal, which also does carry with it that same 12-month compensation. So that's it for the ending tenancy for repairs and renovations. I know there's a lot of questions. We are going to get to the questions at the very end of the presentation. We're going to go right into additional rent increases for capital expenditures now. So starting with something that's really basic, which is understanding what a rent increase is. During a tenancy, landlords, of course, can increase rent as frequently as every 12 months. So essentially what it says in the Act is that you can increase rent, and the timing is such that it cannot be 12 months, less than 12 months from the last time rent was increased or it was established. There's an approved form. There's a notice period, which is 3 months. None of that has changed. It's also important to note that this is specifically to active tenancies. So between tenancies, landlords may set rent to market value. So when a tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in, that's a completely new tenancy. You sign a new tenancy agreement at a new rent. The formula for standard rent increases is inflation. And now inflation can be calculated many different ways. For the purposes of the residential tenancy regulations and rent increases, inflation is calculated as the change, the percentage of change between the average of the last 12 months of BC's all items CPI and the preceding 12 months average. And that's starting from July going back. So at the end of July, in August, we know our full 12 months of BC's all items CPI for the last 12 months. You take an average of that, compare it to the average of the 12 months preceding, and that percentage of change is inflation, as for the purposes of rent increases in BC. Additional rent increases are increases that are applied for by a landlord generally, that are greater than the regular annual rent increase. And there's the circumstances to apply for these types of rent increases are set out in the regulations. When we say apply, it is done through the residential tenancy branch's dispute resolution process. So an arbitrator will be making a decision based on evidence and testimony that is provided, just like any other dispute resolution proceeding. It's done through a conference call, which is convened with an opportunity for both the landlord and tenants to speak and present evidence. So the specific type of rent increase or additional rent increase that we are talking about today is rent increases to cover capital expenditures. So if a landlord has incurred capital expenditures, you are able to apply for this additional rent increase to help cover the costs that you incurred. There are eligibility criteria. We're going to start really quickly with timing. This is one of the most important parts of it when determining whether or not it's really worthwhile for you to actually make this application. The expenditures need to have incurred these expenditures within the last 18 months leading up to the date of application. The important date there is the date of application. They also need to not be expected to recur for at least 5 years. We're going to get into that 5-year timeline a little bit later. Let's move on to just kind of overall eligibility criteria. So the work itself needs to be done with the purpose of installing, repairing, or replacing a major component or a major system. And it needs to either maintain the property in a state of repair that complies with the Residence Attendancy Act, which we'll go into more detail about, or that the major component or major system has failed, is malfunctioning or inoperative, or is close to the end of its useful life, or that the installation, repair, or replacement of this component or system will reduce energy use or greenhouse gas emissions or that it improves the security of the residential property. So we have to meet essentially one criteria in each one of these rows. It needs to install, repair, or replace either a major component or major system. That major system or major component needs to either be failing or malfunctioning or inoperative, or close to its ends of useful life, reduces energy use or greenhouse gas, or improve the security of the residential property, or to comply with the Residence Attendancy Act, which, like I said, we'll get into a bit more detail. So starting with a major component. Well, a component of a residential property is, and specifically a major component, is something that is integral to the residential property or a significant component of a major system, which doesn't give us a ton of information, certainly is a little vague, but it is the information that we have as to how to define a major component as of right now. And we'll go into a bit more detail. A major system would be something such as an electrical system, a mechanical system, a structural system, or something similar that is integral to the residential property, or that is integral to providing services to the tenants and occupants of the residential property. So this information comes directly from the Residence Attendancy branch itself, and we look at it and we say electrical system, mechanical system, structural system, or similar system, and they put that in, and they do put it somewhat vague, that last part, similar system, to ensure that it can cover any possible future systems that they might not necessarily have contemplated when writing the guidelines for this. We talk about the services that are being provided by these major components. This is generally going to be utilities and those types of services, or elevators, sometimes intercom systems. Those are all the types of things that are considered to be services. When it comes to facilities, that would include things like parking, laundry, storage, common recreational areas. Those are all considered to be part of the residential property. So we go back to integral, and it really needs to be the physical integrity. So generally, to consider a major system or a component, it must be essential to support the or enclose the building. It needs to protect the physical integrity or support a critical function of the residential property. Now, if it doesn't meet one of those criteria that we just went over, so if it's not necessarily critical to the building itself, but the work has the effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which might include replacing electric baseboard heating with a heat pump, installing solar panels, replacing single pane windows with double pane windows. If it's one of those types of projects, it can be shown to be one of those types of projects, or it has the effect of meeting that criteria, it may be considered. Additionally, if it doesn't meet one of those other criteria, but it improves the security of the residential property in that it somehow better protects the tenants and the residents of the property, or the property itself, those expenditures may be considered. So some examples of work that may be considered are things like the foundation. So work on the foundation generally is quite extensive. Support walls, support beams, columns, roofing, siding, the pavement and parking areas, especially for larger parking areas, certainly can be considered. Heating systems, which are obviously integral to buildings in terms of the services that are being provided to tenants. Plumbing or sanitary systems, security systems, and of course elevators, which for high-rise buildings are again an integral part of that building. To go into a bit more detail and understanding that there are sometimes situations where there are other laws that might require you to conduct work. So the Residence Attendancy Act says that you must maintain the residential property in a state of decoration and repair. it then goes on to say that complies with the health, safety, and housing standards required by law. And when they say in the Residence Attendancy Act, in this instance, required by law, they're not saying as required necessarily by the Residence Attendancy Act itself. They're alluding to federal, provincial, or municipal laws that may require you to update your building. So things like the fire code, for example, or the building code, or need to conduct energy retrofits. Those are all other laws that the Act contemplates will exist and will have an impact on your business, and states that you must comply with those laws. And this process to apply for these additional increases allows for you to recoup those costs through this process. Determining whether or not something is we're at its end of life can be difficult. We'll get into that a bit more detail. But it's important to note that the work needs to be that it's being contemplated here needs to be done because it is either near its end of life or inoperative. So it doesn't necessarily have to completely break down for you to do this work to then apply for this type of increase. And in fact, in many situations, it would be more costly to wait. So in the instance of a boiler, for example, it's generally more advantageous to go through the work of getting that retrofit done before the system itself actually completely breaks down. You want to have that work done in advance of it breaking down. So there's the most minimal amount of impact on tenants, but also minimal impact on the budget itself. Because if it breaks down, you're going to be rushed to have this work done. And we've covered this in previous topics around energy efficiency in buildings. Cosmetic work is generally something that is not considered, but if the work that is being done does meet the criteria of that we've set out already, and it just so happens to also be cosmetic at the same time, it will still be considered. It's not that it's necessarily not going to be considered because it has some type of cosmetic effect. It's just that it also has to meet one of those very kind of high standard eligibility criteria. So the work that needs to be done must not be expected to be incurred again in 5 years. So that would generally mean things such as routine maintenance. So replacing HVAC filters would generally not be considered eligible expenditures. Now, another ineligibility criteria, or something that makes a capital expenditure ineligible, is that the expenditure was incurred due to inadequate repair or maintenance by the landlord. So if there was an issue, and we're going to use a leaking roof, for example. If a roof is leaking and you're going to have the roof replaced, but it's been leaking for years, and you've known that it's been leaking for years, or you should have known that it was leaking for years, and then the leak has caused other damage to the property. That other damage to the property may not be something that is eligible for these types of rent increases. And the reason being is that they look at that and say, well, if you had replaced the roof sooner, if you had taken action on the thing that was really causing this issue, this other issue would not have occurred. Now, certainly, there's going to be situations where you go through the work, you have the roof replaced, and you discover more damage. And you may not have been aware of that, and you may not have had any way of being aware of that. It may not have been reasonable for you to be aware of that. And if that is the case, then that additional work that you do may be considered. But you'd want to be ready to be able to show that you had no way of knowing this, or you wouldn't have known about this. If you were to receive payment on this twice, so for basically a capital expenditure that you've received monies through grants, rebates, subsidies, or insurance claims or settlements, or through litigation. If you collect an amount to cover that project, that amount that you collect becomes ineligible. So you can't essentially double dip. Additionally, compensation for labor completed by the landlord cannot be claimed, though the material, if you do the labor yourself, may be claimed. In most cases, this is not going to necessarily apply, because if you're going through a large project in a building, such as, say, rewiring the building, it's unlikely that as a landlord, you also just so happen to be qualified and experienced enough to rewire the building. So in most cases, that's not going to apply anyway. So before you apply, you need to determine eligibility. We just went through the eligibility criteria, so you essentially need to apply that lens to your project. If you did it for, again, the reason for the work was to install, repair, or replace a major component or major system, which has the effect of maintaining the property to a state of repair, and that complies with the Residence Attendancy Act and other laws, or that the component or system has failed, is malfunctioning, or is inoperative, or is close to the end of its useful life, or that it reduces energy use or greenhouse gas emissions, or improves the security. If you meet those criteria, then you've met the eligibility criteria, at least on the surface, before an arbitrator reviews the information with you. You then have to determine whether or not it's worth it for you to make this application. So you may have spent a significant amount of time and perhaps a significant amount of money on the capital expenditure, but you do need to be aware of what the application fee is, and whether or not, based on the formula for increase, whether or not it even makes sense. The RTB has a calculator that you can use. It's actually really easy to use. You simply go in, you put in the amount of money that you spent on the expenditure, the number of rental units that are in the building, number of dwelling units, in fact, and we'll get into what that means in a moment, in the building. And from there, it can determine the potential increase. And we say potential because this calculator is making an assumption that all of the capital expenditures that you've put in are in fact eligible, and they won't know that up front. You have to be as honest as you can with that, and hopefully to be as accurate as is possible, but it's up to an arbitrator to actually make the decision. So the formula for the increase for this process is the eligible capital expenditures divided by the number of specified dwelling units in the building or on the residential property, divided by 120. I'm going to go into each one of these a little bit more in detail. So we've already gone over what eligible capital expenditures are. So let's look at the dwelling units. Dwelling units are livable units in a building or residential property in which the capital expenditure was carried out. This applies to livable units whether or not, so regardless of whether it is occupied under a residence or tenancy. So this would mean that it applies to owner-occupied or vacation rentals as well. The next question is, why is it divided by 120? Well, for projects of this nature, it's standard practice, standard accounting practice, to amortize these costs over several years. This is done for quite a few reasons, including for tax. So for the purposes of this process, it was determined that the amortization period will be 10 years, which is 120 months. And since we're looking at this as a monthly rent increase, it is the 120 months that it will be, is the amortization period. When determining the value, you want to look at the fact that you can apply for this increase for any projects that occurred in the 18 months leading up to the date of making the application. So this might affect your timing. You may have redone the roof this month, and in 6 months, you're going to be doing another project that you know will be completed within the 18-month period. So it may be reasonable to put off and wait and do that, make that application, and have all of these capital expenditures from multiple projects all in one application. Additionally, and the reason why this might make sense depending on each individual situation, is that you can only make an application for this once in an 18-month period, unless of course the previous application was dismissed. So if you make an application and it's dismissed, then that doesn't count as an application per se. You can make another application. There's no time limit on that. Additionally, you cannot have more than one ARI in place at any given time. And we'll get into why that makes sense a little bit later, because it can be, the cost can be spread out over several years. So how do we apply for this? Well, it's done through the RTB's intake system, their online intake system for dispute resolution. The fee is $300 plus $10 for each affected unit. All affected units must be included. And as of right now, the understanding is that the maximum is $600. When it comes to evidence, it's the landlord's responsibility to gather and submit evidence to both support the amount of the capital expenditures and that the expenditures meet the eligibility criteria. So before even making the application, we went back to determining value. Well, part of determining value is, do I meet the criteria? So really, before you even get to the application process, you should have your evidence package made up. So you should know that you are in fact going to be successful, at least in part of this. Ultimately, as mentioned, the decision is up to the arbitrator, but as much prep work that can be done is best. When it comes to evidence and the need for the work, you may want to consider including things like photographs of or video taken before and after, copies of the permits obtained showing the work that's being done, any relevant bylaws or construction standards that apply to the situation. You may also want to get expert reports regarding the useful life of the prior system. So if you're looking at, say, a boiler, for example, well, when you're going through the retrofit program for a boiler, part of that retrofit should be obtaining a report saying, well, this is why the retrofit is needed in terms of the system that exists currently, or the prior system, was at its end of life, and this is why. And again, the next part is for the new system, you want to have information pertaining to the expected lifespan of this newly installed, repaired, or replaced system. And again, reason as to why this was necessary. You also want to include things like maintenance records. So we went back to saying, well, if you didn't maintain it properly, you're not able to apply for this increase. So things that you simply just didn't conduct the proper maintenance for won't fit that. So show that you in fact were maintaining the system properly through your maintenance records. You also want documents showing the date the prior system or component was purchased and installed, if you have that, and manufacturer's documents pertaining to the prior system's components' useful life expectancy. So quite often with these types of products, there is some type of documentation to show what the expected life expectancy is. When it comes to evidence for greenhouse gases, you should consider things such as utility bills showing a difference in energy use before and after the installation, the manufacturer's document showing the energy efficiency ratings of the new major system or component, and any expert reports. So if going through a retrofit, you obtain the services of an expert that perhaps provides a pro forma of the work that's being done, this is something where you could include that report to show that it clearly does or is meant and has the effect of reducing greenhouse gases or energy consumption. When it comes to the proof of the expenditure itself, this is going to be things like invoices, receipts, or other proof of payment. You need to be transparent about any funds that you may have received through other sources, such as grants, rebates, insurance payments, or litigation settlements. It's important to note that if you're not upfront about things such as that, if a landlord is found to present fraudulent or misleading information, they may be levied a monetary administrative penalty by the Residence Attendancy branch. So if you were, for example, successful in a grant application for a retrofit, for example, which those are quite popular at the time, and so you received money for this, but you still claimed that amount in your application for a capital expenditure, you may be levied an administrative penalty on that. So it's something to be very aware of, that you need to be upfront about that. After the application itself is made, the tenants must be informed that the landlord has made an application. This is done the same way we do with any type of hearing. There's a notice of proceedings that you serve to the tenant. You also need to supply your evidence. Like I said, you should have that made in advance of the application itself. And when you go through the application, it's going to ask you for some of this information and to show that you really are able to meet their high threshold for evidentiary standards. So landlords will need to provide a robust evidence package showing that the evidence that you've met the eligibility criteria and that you've paid this specific amount of money. As mentioned, this information goes to both RTB and all effective tenants. Tenants can also submit evidence as well. And in some situations, they may even be able to request specific documentation, such as grant applications or rebate applications from their landlord. So the hearing itself is a teleconference, just like most other hearings. The landlord should be prepared to review their evidence, rebut any claims or evidence posed by the tenant, and answer any questions the arbitrator may have. Both landlords and tenants will have an opportunity to speak at these proceedings. To render a decision, the arbitrator will review all evidence and consider any testimony presented at the hearing. The arbitrator is essentially determining the eligibility of the expenditures presented. And this isn't necessarily going to be a decision that's yes, you win, no, you lose. It may be that they allow some expenditures to be approved. They may agree with some aspects of the project that was done or projects, while not necessarily allowing others if they feel it doesn't meet the eligibility criteria. Your best chances of success is doing a significant amount of work up front to ensure that the work that you've done is shown to an arbitrator in a way that makes it easy for them to approve those expenditures. So moving into the increase itself, well, there is a cap on this increase. It'll be presented as, first of all, it's important to note the increase itself will be presented as a dollar value, which can be applied to each tenancy. The increase may be spread over 3 years with a cap of 3% per year. So if we look at a hypothetical situation, we know this isn't necessarily where rents are at or what your expenditure will be, but they're easy numbers to use for the purpose of this. If we looked at an increase where your ARI that you were awarded is $100 and the rent is $1,000 per month, the increases will follow as below on this table. So the ARI total is $100. The rent for that year, at the start of the year, at the start of the increase, is $1,000. Your increase on that rent will be $30. So your rent increase, your new rent is $1,030. That reduces your ARI to $70. So in that next year, we look at an increase and we say, okay, we can raise it up to a maximum of 3%, which is $30.90. So the rent then goes up to $1,060.90. That leaves $39.10 of ARI for the third year. So again, we apply the 3% as the maximum, and we raise the rent to $1,092.77. Now, it's important to note that this table just takes into account the ARI. In addition to the ARI, you'll be able to increase the rent by the allowed percentage for that year. So we go back to the very, very beginning of our presentation. We talked about the kind of regular annual rent increases. That still applies, and that'll affect how much the rent increases each year, which means that it'll affect how much of the ARI is used each year up to that 3% cap, because it is all cumulative. In this example, if there were no other increases, the unapplied ARI would be $7.32. So that simply wouldn't have been applied, and the new rent would be $1,092.77. Like I said, this is based on $1,000 rent and $100 increase. It's going to be different in every situation, clearly. When it comes to serving the increase itself, the rent increase may be served along with the regular annual rent increase. So as I mentioned, these are cumulative. So you have up to 3% for your ARI plus whatever the allowed increase, inflation, is for that year. I know right now there are, of course, limits on increase. In fact, you cannot increase at all right now. That is being lifted. So rent will be able to be increased again for January 1st. Even with this process, though, the rent must not increase more than once in a 12-month period. So the increases must be served on the same form and served at the same time. So when you get an ARI, when you were awarded an additional rent increase, when you go to implement that increase, you can include the percentage, the allowed percentage, the annual allowed percentage, along with the ARI, all on one increase. So we're going to go into some questions now. I see that quite a few questions have come in, so thank you very much for all of your questions. We'll get through as many of these as possible. We might go a little over our 1:30 timeframe. There was a lot of information to cover in today's presentation. Just give me one very quick second here. Let's go to the very beginning of their questions here to talk about the end of tenancy. So a question that was asked here about ending tenancy for repairs or renovations. We mentioned that the unit needs to, the work needs to be such that the unit is vacant for an extended period of time. And the question is, what is that prolonged period of time? What is that extended period of time? What is the minimum that it could be? And the answer to that is that there isn't a strict definition on that. It is going to be dependent on a variety of factors, but in general, they're looking at about 45 days. And they're using the information from their right of first refusal for that same, to get that number. It is somewhat arbitrary. But again, that's not a hard and fast rule. That is simply a general guideline, and it is going to be different in every situation. If, for example, there's just no other accommodation the tenant can find for themselves during that time, or you can't find, then it may still be considered a situation where the tenancy does need to come to an end. And also, to be clear, the process that we're talking about to end tenancy for repairs or renovations is a participatory process. It is a hearing where both landlords and tenants can attend. So if, for example, we have a situation where the work that is being done is say replacing an elevator, and you have a tenant who is reliant on the use of an elevator. They're on the 20th floor and there's simply no way they can get up there. Even on the 5th floor, it doesn't matter. The point of the matter is they're reliant on this. So that's one of those situations where maybe that tenancy can't continue if it's an extended period of time. The question here is, if there's a situation such as a catastrophic flood, does that require the same type of application for an order of possession, or is this tenancy considered frustrated, and as such ends the tenancy? Well, frustrated contracts, and just to be really clear, frustrated contracts is something that is mentioned in the Residence Attendancy Act, but comes from a different piece of legislation, Frustrated Contract Act. In brief, and by no means from a lawyer, but in brief, what we're looking at is a situation where something has occurred through really no fault of either parties. The tenant didn't cause it and the landlord didn't cause it, either through their direct actions or negligence, but something has happened whereby the unit is not habitable. There's no way the tenant can live in the unit. And floods are a good example. We often see floods or things, unfortunately, and gross, like sewers backing up. So in those types of situations, it's clear the tenant cannot live in the unit, and it's probably going to be for an extended period of time, perhaps 6, 7, or even more months. So in those situations, it might be reasonable to consider that tenancy is frustrated. You wouldn't wait 4 months. If the sewer is backed up in the unit, you're not going to apply for a 4-month notice to tenancy. We're going to likely consider that to be frustrated at that time and the tenancy is ended. So we're going to move on to the rent increases. I know there are other questions on the end of tenancy. We will be covering this topic in future webinars as well, as it is a kind of a new process. So just a question regarding how the rent increases would be applied. And how it's calculated. So we look at the number of dwelling units that are in the building. We divide the ARI, the expenditures by that, and divide that then by 120. You get a number. That number is the same number for every single rental unit. So if your ARI amount is $200, for example, it's going to be $200 for every single rental unit. You then apply it to each tenancy to a cap of 3% of that specific tenancy's rent. So while the ARI total, that number will be the same and equal for every tenancy, the amount of increase they actually see is dependent on a percentage of their existing rent. So again, it will be different from tenancy to tenancy. So a question that's come in here is, if you say have a residential property that has more than one structure on it, for example, a property that has 2 towers and maybe a parking garage, and the work is being done in the parking garage, can you apply for an ARI for that building, because it's not in the building itself? And the answer is yes. It is a facility of the residential property, so it does apply, and you are able to apply for all of the units to receive that increase, and that's regardless of the use of parking or not. It is an improvement to the facility itself. It's also important to note that this answers a few questions in terms of the arbitrators being able to handle these types of situations. Is that part of the advocacy work that LandlordBC did, which was quite extensive, and it did go through the process from the very beginning with the Rent Housing Task Force all the way through to now, where we are still advocating in regards to this process. And one of the most recent topics that we had raised and seems to be has been taken up, is that the residence or tenancy branch will have dedicated arbitrators for both of these two processes, both for the ARI process and for the ending tenancy for repairs or renovations. And that's important because both of these topics are quite a bit more complicated than your average issue that may come across an arbitrator's desk. And they're going to need to have knowledge in the type of work that is being done in these buildings to be able to ensure that that they are in fact actually making decisions that are consistent and timely as well. So that was a very positive thing that, like I said, we had advocated quite a few times with the residence or tenancy branch. Question that has come up here is, will the ARI be additional to the provincial guideline increase? And the answer is yes, it is an additional rent increase, which means it is additional to the inflation increase. And they are cumulative, so they will affect each other in terms of multi-year increases. And to answer another question here is, because there are different models for this in different jurisdictions. In British Columbia, this process for ARI will be such that once a decision is made, the increase can then take effect. And it's still 3 months notice. So the increase is not retroactive. It's not from the date of making the application. It is 3 months after notice of rent increase is served. So when it comes to making the application, you're going to include all applicable dwelling units in the formula. You may choose to not necessarily apply the increase to every single tenancy, especially in situations where, say, someone has just moved in at market rent versus someone who's been there for 10 years. It may not make sense to apply that increase at that time. And a question that has come in, are you required to serve tenants of notice of the rent increase through the new RTB ARI notice form? And the answer is yes. When serving a rent increase that includes an ARI, there is a new form for that rent increase. And it includes both the ARI and the standard inflation-based increase on that one form. So we're going to leave the questions there. I know that other questions have come in, and I appreciate that. Well, like I said, this is just the beginning of our coverage of this topic. We'll have more information on this as this process is used and we see decisions coming out. So watch our e-news and our magazine for more information about future opportunities to learn about this process. I want to thank again our sponsors for this, which are Switch and Sparkle Charge Solutions. So again, thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to Laura for the presentation at the beginning of today's webinar. Thank you, and everyone have a wonderful day.